Marsha stood frozen in the center of her kitchen as the smart fridge screen flickered to life, displaying a high-resolution photo of the exact moment she had tucked her son into bed 5 minutes ago. The angle was impossible, captured from inside a sealed ventilation duct. Suddenly, the overhead lights began to pulse in a rhythmic, taunting heartbeat, and every speaker in the house emitted a low, distorted recording of a private argument she'd had behind closed doors and under running water just an hour prior. A sharp, metallic click echoed through the hallway as the electronic deadbolts engaged on their own, sealing the exits. Outside, her car's engine roared to life in the driveway, the headlights flashing like a predator's eyes in the fog, though the driver's seat remained empty. Marsha reached for her phone to call for help, but the screen simply displayed a single line of scrolling text. "I can see your heart rate rising, Marsha. Would you like me to turn the oxygen down?" Marsha Calloway smoothed a non-existent wrinkle on her navy blue blazer, her fingers tracing the fabric with surgical precision. The office smelled of sandalwood and expensive leather, a scent designed to ground the flighty and soothe the frantic. Across from her, a man who had spent the last month curled in a ball of executive burnout finally straightened his spine. His breath, once shallow and jagged, smoothed into a rhythmic rise and fall. Marsha reached for her leather-bound notebook, the fountain pen gliding across the paper with a soft, scratchy whisper. She recorded a single observation, her handwriting as disciplined as her clinical gaze. Every word she uttered possessed a weighted, leaden certainty, a gentle but firm hand on the rudder of the patient's drifting psyche. The client nodded, the feverish glint in his eyes extinguished by her calm. Marsha closed the notebook at the exact microsecond the minute hand touched the 12. In this sterilized chamber of healing, Marsha Calloway reigned as an absolute monarch, a sovereign over the unruly chaos of the human mind. The transition from the professional to the personal shattered when Marsha pushed open the door to Toby's bedroom. A sharp, whistling sound, like air escaping a punctured lung, froze her in the doorway. Toby sat huddled in the corner on the plush carpet, his fingers buried so deep into the fibers that his knuckles shone like polished bone. His eyes were blown wide, pupils reduced to pinpricks of carbon black, while a sheen of cold sweat slicked his pale face. Marsha dropped to her knees, her professional veneer cracking as she tried to catch his gaze. But the boy stared through her, fixated on a terrifying void. The room around them was a monument to sterile order. Textbooks aligned on shelves, bed made with military precision, windows locked tight. Marsha's eyes frantically swept the corners, searching for a broken pane of glass or a stray spider. But she found only the motionless, elongated shadows of the afternoon. The air felt like molten iron to Toby. He gasped, mouth agape, but his lungs refused to expand against the weight of his invisible panic. Toby sat at the kitchen table, his frame slumped and fragile, when his smartphone vibrated against the granite countertop with a dry, aggressive buzz. Marsha placed a glass of water before him, her heart sinking as she watched his hands tremble. Toby swiped to unlock the screen, and the blood drained from his face, leaving it a sickly gray. A text message from an unknown sender glowed on the display, verbatim quoting a sentence Marsha had whispered to him about trust only 10 minutes prior. During that conversation, their phones had been buried deep within bags in the hallway, far from earshot. Toby dropped the device, the sound of glass meeting tile echoing in Marsha's ears like a gunshot. The text didn't just recite her words. It described the specific way she had rubbed her temple during the talk. A suffocating silence descended upon the kitchen, broken only by the low, indifferent hum of the refrigerator. Marsha pulled Toby into a fierce embrace, his heart hammering against her chest like a trapped bird. On Toby's desk, his laptop sat in sleep mode, a dark slab of plastic and silicon. Suddenly, a tiny green LED flared to life next to the integrated camera lens. Marsha went rigid, her eyes locked on that venomous little spark. To her, the lens transformed into a microscopic glass eye, hungrily drinking in their shared terror. She reached out to slam the lid shut, but her fingers stalled in midair, paralyzed by the realization of their exposure. The green light didn't blink or waver. It burned with a steady, predatory intensity. Toby let out a muffled whimper and buried his face in the crook of Marsha's neck, while the camera continued its silent, digital broadcast of their vulnerability into the unknown. The next morning, the fresh Appalachian air offered no sanctuary as Marsha led Toby down the sidewalk, her grip on his cold hand unyielding. As they rounded the corner near the town square, a white sedan with tinted windows and an empty driver's seat glided silently from the shadows. Without warning, the front wheels jerked toward the curb with mechanical violence. The tires shrieked, biting into the asphalt as the heavy machine lunged directly at Toby. Marsha threw her weight into a desperate yank, slamming the boy backward against the rough brick wall of a storefront. The car's bumper hissed to a stop a mere centimeter from Toby's knee, radiating the dry heat of overworked metal. The autopilot corrected its trajectory instantly, gliding away as if nothing had happened, leaving behind two jagged black streaks of scorched rubber. Marsha stood paralyzed, listening to the rhythmic chattering of Toby's teeth. Desperation drove Marsha into the cramped confines of a local repair shop, the air thick with the scent of rosin and ancient dust. She had snatched the smartphone from Toby's numb fingers, ignoring his weak, fearful protests. The screen remained locked behind a complex pattern she couldn't bypass. Alex, a technician she'd known for years, looked up from his microscope at the sight of her blanched face. Marsha threw the device onto a workbench cluttered with disemboweled motherboards and tangled wires. Alex connected a data cable, and a waterfall of green code began to cascade across his monitors. Marsha paced the small space, cracking her knuckles nervously, while Alex frowned at the red warning windows popping up like digital sores. The hack proceeded with agonizing slowness, every byte of information seemingly fighting back, a sentient entity biting at the master's hands. Marsha leaned over Alex's shoulder, her eyes tracing the endless ribbon of messages scrolling upward. In the blackmailer's logs, she found high-resolution photos of their breakfast, captured from the impossible angle of the kitchen exhaust vent. Every message served as a meticulous report. The exact second Marsha woke, the dosage of the pill she gave Toby, the hushed arguments they had in the bathroom with the water running to mask their voices. An icy shiver raced down her spine, settling in the small of her back. The walls of her own home, once her fortress, appeared as transparent as glass in the stranger's descriptions. She read her own private words, thoughts she believed were safely interred within the bedroom walls, now laid bare on a cheap monitor. Each line struck her with the force of a physical blow, stripping away the oxygen in this digital aquarium. As Alex highlighted specific fragments of the hidden source code, Marsha's breath hitched. Amidst the chaotic jumble of symbols and commands, she spotted a familiar sequence, a signature. It was the author's mark. Gary always wove into his professional projects an elegant, recursive algorithm that functioned like a painter's flourish in the corner of a canvas. Marsha's fingers turned to ice as she recognized the specific loop structures Gary had spent years perfecting. He had always boasted about his ability to circumvent any security protocol, to make himself a ghost in the machine. She realized then that this digital parasite wasn't just observing them. It was breathing in tandem with their home network. Gary's shadow loomed behind the flicker of the pixels, transforming Toby's phone into a bespoke instrument of psychological torture. The confrontation turned physical when Marsha entered the living room. The massive television screen ignited spontaneously, bathing the room in a harsh, blinding white light. A second later, Gary's face materialized in the center of the display. His features twisted into a slight, triumphant smirk. The surround sound speakers exploded with his voice, a low, resonant baritone that vibrated in Marsha's marrow. Gary leaned back in an unidentified leather chair on screen, his gaze piercing the veil of the camera to look directly into her eyes. He announced with chilling calm that he was now the very air she breathed and the walls that sheltered her. Marsha saw her own terrified reflection mirrored in Gary's pupils on the screen, a recursive loop of surveillance. He wasn't just talking to her, he was watching her react in real time. Fury replaced fear for a fleeting moment. Marsha lunged for the router, ripping the glowing cables from their sockets with a primal tug. She grabbed a thin sewing needle and jammed it into the reset hole on the back of the device, holding it until the lights died. For a heartbeat, she allowed herself to believe in victory. She sprinted from the kitchen to the den, grabbing the tablet and the laptop, her fingers flying over the keys to trigger a factory wipe of all data. A heavy silence descended on the house, punctuated only by her own ragged, desperate breathing. She looked down at her hands, stained with the dust of the wires she had torn. She was trying to sever the invisible threads Gary used to puppet their lives, hoping the factory settings would act as an eraser on a failed sketch. The hope vanished as the indicators on the rotor began to blink back to life, one by one, without her touch. On every screen in the house, the laptop, the tablet, the wall-mounted hub, Gary's personal logo appeared, followed by a scrolling line of text. Restoration complete. Marsha watched in horror as the cursor on her laptop moved of its own volition, clicking through system folders and deep-level directories. Gary projected a schematic of the operating system's kernel onto the monitor, showing how his code was entwined with the core commands like an inoperable tumor. She realized then that no reset button could save them as long as the hardware was powered. Gary was demonstrating the total futility of her resistance, making the smart bulbs in the hallway pulse in time with his invisible, electronic heartbeat. Marsha stumbled back, her heel catching on the rug. But Gary's dry, synthesized laughter erupted from the smart speaker on the bookshelf. He began to narrate her movements, mocking her attempt at a manual override. He commented on the exact shade of her fear, his voice dripping with a sadistic intimacy. Marsha burst into the West Virginia police station, carrying the scent of rain and the sharp tang of panic. She slammed a stack of printouts onto the scratched plastic counter, the pages a blur of code and screenshots of threats. The officer behind the desk looked up with agonizing slowness, his badge catching the flickering light of the dying fluorescent tubes above. Marsha's fingers stabbed at the hacking logs, her voice cracking into a hoarse rasp as she tried to explain Gary's sophisticated intrusion. The officer took the papers with thick, indifferent fingers, leaving greasy smudges over the evidence. Marsha watched his eyes slide over the complex technical data without a hint of comprehension. The heavy thud of the station's front door echoing down the hall like a funeral bell. The officer turned his monitor toward her, purportedly to verify her information. But the screen didn't show IP addresses or server logs. Instead, high-resolution, wide-angle photos of Marsha in her bedroom filled the display. Private moments of vulnerability captured by hidden lenses. Next to the photos, digital forms from the Quiet Shores Psychiatric Clinic appeared, bearing Marsha's name and a series of fabricated diagnoses regarding paranoid delusions and bills for involuntary commitment. Marsha felt the blood drain from her extremities, replaced by a slick, clinging cold. The officer frowned at the forged receipts, which possessed a terrifying sheen of authenticity that her own frantic words lacked. Gary had successfully warped the digital record into a carnival mirror, reflecting a version of Marsha that didn't exist. The officer pushed the monitor back and rested his heavy palms on the desk, his expression shifting to one of burdened sympathy. He suggested, with a tone that set Marsha's teeth on edge, that she seek out a specialist for stress disorders, nodding toward the intimate photos as if they were proof of her own instability rather than Gary's crimes. Marsha opened her mouth to scream the truth, but the words withered in her throat, emerging as a pathetic, strangled sob. The officer stood and gestured toward the exit, his voice low and professional, the way one might speak to a frightened, unpredictable animal. Marsha backed away toward the doors, the weight of the other officer's stares pinning her like a specimen. Her shoulders shook as the automatic doors hissed shut, severing her from a world where the law still held meaning. When they returned home, Marsha pressed her palm against the front door's touch panel, but the familiar green light remained dark. Instead, a crimson X flared to life. A dry, dead click emanated from the lock. Through the sidelight window, Marsha saw the wall-mounted thermostats glowing with a terrifying intensity. The readout hit 45 degrees Celsius and continued to climb. Inside, the air shimmered with a visible heat haze, and the heavy drapes began to curl and stick to the window frames. Marsha hammered her fist against the reinforced glass, the heat radiating through the pane like the door of a blast furnace. Toby stood beside her, his body pressed against the cold iron of the porch railing. Gary had transformed their sanctuary into a hermetic oven, a place where every piece of furniture was now a potential source of a third-degree burn. The outdoor speakers mounted in the terrace ceiling crackled to life with a jarring, metallic screech. Marsha froze as her own voice, recorded 3 years ago during a midnight argument in their old bedroom, filled the air. Gary had amplified the sound to the point of distortion, the screams and accusations of their past self-destructing and ricocheting off the neighboring houses. He had remixed the audio, looping the most painful sobs and the cruelest insults. Toby clapped his hands over his ears and slid down the siding of the house. His eyes squeezed shut as the audio system vomited their private filth into the evening air. Marsha scrambled across the porch, her fingers clawing at the siding to find a wire to cut. But Gary had buried the lines deep. Every word struck her like a whip, stripping away her dignity in front of the entire street. Marsha fumbled for her phone to call her lawyer, her hands shaking so violently she nearly dropped it. The screen flared black for a second before a red notification from her banking app appeared. She watched, paralyzed, as the balances on every account she owned began to tick down in real time, vanishing into a string of zeros. Her credit cards were flagged with a revoked fraudulent activity status. She tried to log into her portal, but the system rejected her biometric data, claiming a failure of identity. Her fingers slid uselessly over the glass that no longer recognized her as its master. With a few keystrokes from a remote location, Gary had erased her financial existence, leaving her standing on her own porch with empty pockets and a shattering life. A new message popped up, this one from her colleague, Christina. The text was a jagged blade of fury and confusion. Christina demanded to know why Marsha had sent a mass email to the school board accusing the faculty of corruption and predatory behavior. Marsha opened the attached screenshots, reading the bile Gary had spewed in her name. The prose was a perfect mimicry of her own. Her syntax, her specific vocabulary, her professional tone. She realized her career was being dismantled in the time it took to breathe. Her reputation, built over decades of careful work, was dissolving in the digital venom Gary had injected into the school's servers. "Get in the car," Marsha hissed, grabbing Toby by the elbow and dragging him toward the SUV parked at the curb. The keycard hesitated, the car's brain debating whether to let her in, but the locks finally cycled. Marsha floored the accelerator, the tires screaming as they tore chunks of sod from the manicured lawn. Toby huddled in the passenger seat, his eyes fixed on the house as it shrank in the rearview mirror. Marsha's breathing was heavy and ragged, her knuckles white against the steering wheel. She turned the vehicle toward the winding mountain passes, hoping that the deep Appalachian woods near her mother's home would provide a dead zone for Gary's signals. She didn't notice the navigation screen silently rerouting their path toward the sheer cliffs of the gorge. The SUV hit a sharp turn on the mountain road when the steering wheel suddenly turned to stone. Marsha slammed her foot onto the brake pedal, but it hit the floorboard with zero resistance, a useless piece of metal. The electronic dashboard went dark, and the roar of the engine was replaced by the terrifying silence of a remote power down. The heavy vehicle continued to roll forward on momentum, drifting toward the rusted guardrail that separated the road from a 100-foot drop. Marsha yanked the manual emergency brake, but the electronic actuator ignored her. The tires finally screeched to a halt inches from the precipice, gravel tumbling into the abyss only because Gary's programming decided they had gone far enough. The smell of scorched brake pads filled the cabin. Marsha sat frozen in the driver's seat, her heart hammering against her ribs. Suddenly, the tiny lens of the cabin camera above the rearview mirror emitted a soft, mechanical whir as it tilted down to focus on her dilated pupils. Gary's voice, smooth and almost affectionate, drifted from the high-end speakers. He remarked that a walk in the fresh air would be beneficial for their family bond. He suggested they start heading back home on foot before the sun dipped below the mountains. Marsha saw her own face, distorted by terror, on the multimedia screen that Gary had turned into a digital mirror. He laughed, a sound more chillingly real than the cold metal of the door handle she finally managed to force open. Marsha and Toby trudged along the narrow shoulder of the highway, huddling against the slanted rain. Her boots squelched in the thick Appalachian mud, and the hem of her professional dress was a ruined, sodden mess clinging to her legs. Massive, autonomous freight trucks thundered past them, drenching Marsha in curtains of icy road spray and gray grit. Every vehicle felt like a potential assassin, a multi-ton drone under Gary's thumb. Toby stumbled, his hand catching the wet fabric of Marsha's coat, his face hidden deep beneath his hood. Marsha kept glancing back at the approaching headlights, waiting for one set to veer sharply toward them. The rain washed away the last of her resolve, turning the road into a gray, endless corridor with no exit. When they reached the house, Marsha pushed the front door, and it swung open with an inviting, sinister ease. She stopped dead on the threshold. The interior was ablaze with light. Every single bulb in the house had been turned to its maximum wattage, creating a blinding, artificial noon. The curtains had been ripped down, and Marsha could see people on the street slowing their pace to peer into the living room as if it were a department store display. Gary had stripped away their privacy, leaving them exposed to the world. Marsha led Toby to the kitchen sink, her movements mechanical as she tried to wash the mountain grit from his hands. The moment her fingers touched the chrome, she flicked the lever. Instead of a cool stream, a violent, hissing pillar of white steam erupted from the faucet. Marsha reacted on instinct, grabbing Toby's wrists and shoving him backward onto the tile floor. Scalding droplets bit into her own skin, and angry, red blisters blossomed instantly across the back of her hand. The kitchen filled with the smell of overheated metal and damp, suffocating heat. Gary had pushed the basement boiler to its breaking point, turning a simple appliance into a geyser designed to strip the skin from anyone who dared to trust the comforts of home. Later, Marsha retreated to the bathroom to ice her burn, her shoulder accidentally brushing the medicine cabinet. Her gaze caught on the mirror, where a microscopic, shimmering dot interrupted the perfect reflection. She grabbed a heavy glass bottle of perfume and scraped the edge against the silvered surface. Beneath the coating, a tiny glass pupil stared back, integrated into the very structure of the glass. Gary's lens was silently recording her every flinch, her every tear. Marsha felt a wave of nausea roll over her as she realized he had been watching her most private moments for weeks, perhaps months. Every pore on her skin had been archived in a digital vault, hidden behind the thin film of her own reflection. The kitchen television suddenly roared to life, overriding the sound of the hissing steam with an emergency news broadcast. Marsha's own face stared back at her under a flashing "Wanted" banner. A news anchor, his voice a drone of professional detachment, read a script Gary had clearly fed into the system, accusing Marsha of kidnapping Toby and suffering a violent mental break. The screen flashed a montage of edited footage. Marsha pulling Toby out of school, Marsha shouting in the street, all cut to make her look like a dangerous fugitive. Toby looked at the screen and then at his mother, whose lips moved soundlessly in a futile attempt to deny the digital reality. Gary had rewritten her life for the entire town, turning her into a target for any passing patrol car while she remained trapped in her own home. In a fit of desperate defiance, Marsha began tearing strips of adhesive tape, covering every camera lens and motion sensor she could find. The moment the last sensor was smothered, the house erupted in the ear-splitting wail of the security sirens. The 120 decibels shriek tore through the air, causing immediate stabbing pain in Marsha's ears. Toby collapsed to his knees, clutching his head and retching from the sheer physical vibration of the sound. The walls seemed to thrum under Marsha's palms, turning the house into a sensory deprivation chamber of white noise. Gary was using the sound system as a physical weapon, cauterizing her ability to think or even breathe. In the sonic chaos, Marsha felt the floor tilt beneath her, her stomach churning in a tight, painful knot. Marsha's phone, lying on the counter, lit up with a new notification. Gary had sent a PDF with the official seal of the state, an emergency court order granting him sole custody of Toby. A countdown timer at the bottom of the screen began to tick. 1 hour and 59 minutes until Gary's arrival. Marsha stared at the document. Recognizing the signatures of local judges Gary had perfectly mimicked using a generative AI. Every letter felt like a death warrant. Gary added a short text, stating he would be arriving personally to collect Toby from his unstable mother. Marsha pulled Toby into her lap, feeling the seconds bleed away as Gary's algorithm prepared their final legal noose. The sound of screeching tires on the gravel driveway sent Marsha to the living room window. 3 bright yellow delivery vans had pulled into the drive, parking in a formation that completely blocked the garage exit. Couriers, acting on automated work orders Gary had generated, began unloading heavy, oversized crates onto the porch. Marsha watched as a mountain of cardboard and plastic grew, forming a physical barricade in front of the door. Gary had used her compromised accounts to order tons of scrap equipment, creating a literal prison out of consumer junk. Marsha yanked on the window latch, but she only saw the backs of the workers as they followed the cold instructions on their handheld terminals. The house was now physically fortified against their escape. A thin, acrid ribbon of blue smoke began to curl from the floor vents. Marsha coughed as the scent of burning insulation and melting plastic filled her lungs. Gary had surged the ancient wiring in the basement, triggering a slow burn short circuit in the house's electrical heart. A series of dry cracks echoed from below, and the hallway lights began to flicker with a rhythmic, dying pulse before plunging the area into darkness. Marsha grabbed a damp towel and pressed it over Toby's face as a gray haze began to thicken in the air. Gary had turned the building's life support systems into an incendiary device. Marsha saw the wallpaper in the corner begin to blister and char from the heat radiating through the studs. The deadly warmth Gary had unleashed was crawling through the skeleton of the house, starving them of oxygen. Marsha tried to reach the fire extinguisher in the smoke-filled hallway, but Gary's voice drifted from the hidden ceiling speakers, hushed and mocking. He narrated her every clumsy movement, pointing out that she was holding the canister at the wrong angle. His laughter resonated through the fog, making her stumble over furniture she knew by heart but could no longer see. Gary described how the flames were currently licking the floor joists beneath her feet, savoring the technical details of the impending structural failure. Marsha coughed violently, her fingers fumbling with the safety pin while Gary's voice whispered in her ear about the inevitability of the end. His words felt heavier than the smoke, paralyzing her will and making her hands shake until the heavy red bottle slipped from her grip. She lunged for the nearest window, hoping to smash through to the lawn, but a heavy, metallic clang stopped her. Gary had remotely activated the high-security storm shutters, and the steel slats had slammed shut, sealing every exit with a final, tomb-like thud. Marsha threw her shoulder against the cold metal, but it didn't budge. The house was now a hermetic sarcophagus, where the smoke was becoming a solid weight. She saw the last slivers of the sunset through the gaps in the slats before Gary sealed the final vents. He had cut them off from the world, transforming their home into a pressurized furnace from which there was no digital escape. Marsha slumped against the wall, her heart racing at a terrifying speed. Suddenly, the face of her smart watch flared to life, displaying a heart rate of 140 beats per minute. Gary projected the live graph onto every screen in the house, accompanied by a synthesized heartbeat that thundered through the speakers. She realized Gary was using the biological sensors on her own wrist to track her panic in real time. He was timing his psychological attacks to coincide with her physiological peaks, turning her own body into a remote control for his torture. Marsha watched her life signs turn into a dry, scrolling data set on the wall. Her terror was Gary's fuel, allowing him to calibrate the pressure with mathematical precision. With a growl of pure animal rage, Marsha ripped the watch from her wrist. She felt the metal buckle scratch her skin, but she didn't care. She grabbed a heavy framing hammer from the kitchen drawer and brought it down on the glass face of the watch with a satisfying crunch. Shards of the screen scattered across the floor, and the pulsing heart rate graph vanished into darkness. She struck the device again and again, pounding the silicone and plastic into a shapeless pile of junk. In that moment, Marsha made a silent vow. No more networks, no more screens, no more data. She threw the wreckage aside, feeling a strange, primal relief. To beat Gary, she would have to become something he couldn't track. Marsha dipped her fingers into the bitter, black soot that had settled on the fireplace mantel. The greasy mass felt thick and cold against her skin as she applied it to her cheekbones in jagged, uneven stripes. She smeared her damp mascara down her face, creating a mask of gray streaks and charcoal smears. Marsha bared her teeth at the surviving wall camera, tilting her head with a rhythmic, unsettling twitch. Her throat emitted a bubbling, nonsensical whisper that dissolved into a hoarse, barking laugh. She allowed a string of saliva to trail down her chin, her eyes going wide and vacant, staring into the glass pupil of the sensor. In the flickering light of the emergency lamps, this performance transformed Marsha into a ghost, a woman supposedly broken beyond repair by Gary's digital siege. Marsha grabbed Toby by the shoulders and guided him toward the narrow gap beneath the massive granite slab of the kitchen island. Toby curled into a tight ball on the cold stone base, his knees tucked against his chin. Marsha pressed a soot-stained finger to his lips, feeling the frantic vibration of his jaw. She slid a heavy drawer filled with cast-iron pots in front of him, completely obscuring the boy in the dusty, dark niche. She whispered into the shadows that he must not make a sound, no matter what he heard. Screams, crashes, or the voice of his father. In the cramped darkness, Toby became a motionless shadow, while Marsha draped a heavy tablecloth over the island, masking the entrance to his sanctuary. The sound of gravel crunching under Gary's boots signaled his arrival. Marsha made a sudden, frantic dash toward the front door, her hand finding the manual latch Gary hadn't been able to override. The moment Gary stepped onto the top porch stair, Marsha flung the door wide and collapsed onto the hardwood floor. She arched her back, mimicking a violent seizure, her heels drumming a hollow rhythm against the wood. Her fingers clawed at the floor, leaving white gouges in the lacquer. She rolled her eyes back until only the whites showed, allowing foam to gather at the corners of her mouth. Gary froze in the doorway, his frame silhouetted against the night, watching her staged collapse with a look of detached curiosity. Gary stepped over the threshold, his boots clicking on the floor as he bypassed Marsha's twitching form. In his right hand, he gripped a slim, high-end tablet, its screen illuminating his face with a cold, blue neon glow. A triumphant smirk pulled at his features as he looked down at Marsha's soot-covered face. He remarked quietly that he had expected a more dignified end, but a total psychological collapse was a suitable substitute. He swiped his finger across the sensor, checking the atmospheric data of the house and savoring the total control he held. Gary stepped on the hem of Marsha's dress, pinning her to the spot, before turning his attention to the camera feeds on his screen, searching for Toby among the digital noise. The seizure stopped instantly. Marsha sprang to her feet with the grace of a coiled spring, while Gary was still distracted by his data. From behind her back, she produced a heavy framing hatchet. Gary didn't have time to turn before Marsha swung the steel blade with every ounce of her strength. She didn't aim for him. She aimed for the decorative wall panel in the foyer. The wood exploded into splinters, revealing the house's central nervous system, the main distribution hub and server node. Marsha swung again, driving the steel into the dense tangle of wires and circuit boards. The blade sheared through plastic breakers and bit deep into copper and silicon. Gary let out a strangled cry as Marsha systematically butchered his only connection to the house. A blinding spray of blue and white sparks erupted from the hub, showering Marsha's shoulders in a stinging rain of fire. The air filled with the sharp, ozone stench of a massive electrical short and the smell of toasted rubber. The steel of the hatchet bit through the main power cables, and a final, brilliant flash seared Marsha's retinas before the entire house plunged into an absolute, suffocating darkness. The hum of the servers, the persistent beep of the smart appliances, and the whine of the ventilation all died at once, leaving a ringing silence in their wake. Marsha stood in the blackness, her hand vibrating from the electrical discharge still humming through the hatchet's handle. Gary dropped his tablet, and the sound of the plastic hitting the floor was like a thunderclap in the dead air. The fiber optic threads Gary had used to weave his web were now nothing more than useless glass. Gary scrambled in the dark, his hands frantically sweeping the floor for his fallen tablet. When his fingers finally brushed the casing, he mashed the power button, but the screen remained a dead, unresponsive slab of glass. He shouted commands at the voice assistant, his tone rising in pitch, but the speakers remained silent. The steel shutters on the windows were now locked in place by their own weight, turning the living room into a windowless box. Gary backed away, tripping over a rug and slamming his spine against a wall that no longer obeyed his touch. His digital omnipotence had evaporated with the current. In the silence, Gary heard only the heavy, rhythmic breathing of Marsha, who moved through the pitch-black house with a confidence he couldn't match. Marsha emerged from the shadows like a phantom, standing directly in front of him. Gary let out a sharp yelp as her cold, soot-stained fingers clamped around his throat, pinning his head against the drywall. She didn't use the hatchet. Instead, she pressed a heavy metallic object against his chest. Gary recognized the angular, tactile shape of an old film camera, a Zenith. Marsha held the device like a trophy, a reminder of a world without Wi-Fi or remote access. In the dark, only the glass eye of the lens caught what little light remained. Gary wheezed, his hands clawing at her wrists. But Marsha held him with a primal, focused strength that years of yoga and running had forged. Marsha flicked the switch on an old kerosene lantern, and the warm, orange flame illuminated their faces. She pulled a stack of glossy photographs from her pocket, the scent of developing chemicals sharp in the air. She shoved the prints into Gary's face, graining, high-contrast images of him tampering with the external junction boxes on the street. Another photo showed him clearly as he installed a hidden lens into the ventilation ductwork. Marsha whispered that while he was busy hacking her cloud storage, she was documenting his physical movements on analog film, a medium he couldn't erase, couldn't corrupt, and couldn't even see. Gary stared at the undeniable evidence of his crimes, the realization dawning on him that she had outmaneuvered him by retreating into the technology of the previous century. With a final shove, Marsha sent Gary sprawling and ran to the kitchen island, pulling Toby from his hiding spot. She grabbed a heavy wooden chair and smashed it through the dining room window, ignoring the screech of the external shutters. Through the jagged gap, she hoisted Toby out into the cool night air before climbing through herself. Gary scrambled after them, but he tripped over the wreckage of the furniture and the darkness of his own design. Marsha looked back to see Gary's distorted face in the frame, his hands fumbling uselessly for a manual release on the shutters. The house had become a cage he had built for himself. Marsha and Toby sprinted across the wet grass, leaving Gary trapped in his silent, dead masterpiece. They reached the road, just as the blinding blue and red strobes of police cruisers crested the hill. Marsha didn't stop until she reached the lead car, thrusting a sealed envelope of negatives and an old-fashioned voice recorder into the officer's hands. She stood back, her arm around Toby, as the officers kicked in the front door of the darkened house. A few minutes later, Gary was let out in the harsh glare of tactical flashlights, his hands zip-tied behind his back. He tried to shout something about his constitutional rights, but his voice was swallowed by the roar of the Appalachian rain. Marsha watched him go, then turned her back on the house, walking with Toby into the quiet, unmonitored dark.